Any risks to think about? I mean, other with any investment decisions?
There's always going to be risks. I think there will likely be a correction and volatility. When you look at the long term and people look at the growth story for the next 5-10 years, that growth story is not going to change. So I think that's a likely source of short-term volatility, but possibly not a long-term risk.
Just to kind of pivot a bit in terms of understanding a bit more about your team and your proposition, what differentiates your investment team, in terms of the proposition? I mean, just having boots on the ground matter? Does that give you an edge? Or do you think it's something you just have to have?
I think, Tariq, it's a whole bunch of things. It's not one. First of all, we have a local team. We have a team on the ground in India. Our team's been on the ground for over 30 years, extremely well networked. Whether it's the corporates, whether it's supply chains, the financial markets, very integrated into the India landscape. And I think India is important. India is a very distinct market where local trends, local practices, policy matters, and you need to be plugged into that, both in terms of understanding the upside, but equally importantly in figuring out what the risks are. So we've been there for over 30 years. We've got a team of almost 20 people on the ground in India, purely on the investing side, focusing on Indian equities. We're also able to tap into our wider investment team around the world, both in the emerging world as well as developed world. And a lot of what's happening in India is a follow-on from themes we've seen elsewhere, whether it's the internet economy in China, we're seeing that play out in India, whether it's what's happening in AI elsewhere that's playing out in certain businesses in India. So that ability to leverage what we have together with our boots on the ground, I think is a huge advantage.
And your investment philosophy, how do you kind of approach portfolios in terms of thinking?
Well, I think you have to be very focused on the long-term story. I think to your point about valuations, you can get caught in the here and now, but focusing on the long term is very important. We're always looking at quality businesses. We're looking at businesses with strong models, with strong balance sheets, with strong management. We're looking at sustainable business models, businesses that can drive sustainable growth over the long term. And obviously, we're looking at where we find value. And value, we mean intrinsic value, right? Companies that are cheap relative to their long-term earnings potential and their long-term growth. That means you can get a lot of interesting businesses in India which have a long-term growth story, a compounding story, as well as some businesses that are benefiting from this cyclical upside we're seeing right now as the cycle continues to develop.
So Manraj, if I was to summarize the theme and the thesis for India today, the way you kind of think about this is very much that yes, recognizing valuations are perhaps expensive, but when you look at the structural story coming in, kind of an exposure to India, where a client really has to think about India longer term to kind of really take and participate on the opportunities that are arising. And this could be broad-based, I guess, right? Across sectors, or do you think there's some sectors that you favor, you believe, are the more catalyst of the growth story?
There are a range of sectors we like, the range of stocks we like, but I do think India's a unique story. I think it's a very differentiated story. When we look at the growth that's happening around the world, you have good growth in North America, tepid growth in places like Europe, similarly in Japan. And then when you look in the emerging world, it's very difficult to find clear structural long-term growth stories. And India stands out. And India stands out for structural reasons. India stands out for penetration of financial investors around the world. And it's a long-term story. And what's also interesting about India is it's a relatively uncorrelated market. So a lot of the rest of the world depends on growth from the developed world, in particular the US, what's happening with liquidity, what's happening with interest rates. India is actually fairly distinct in that respect. It's an uncorrelated story. It's driven by domestic growth. There's structural reasons. So from a portfolio point of view, it gives you something quite different. So I think it's a great story for the long term.
In terms of your kind of approach to investing, philosophically, how do you sort of think about your portfolios from a construction standpoint?
With portfolio construction, the basis is always fundamental. The basis is always valuation-based. It is driven by our estimations of what the future looks like. But when you put it all together, you have to take a view. And the numbers are very important, but the numbers don't always tell you everything. And as with our location, there is some art, some perspective, some unique viewpoints you need to have. And it's unique to different investment styles, but you do need to have a view that's differentiated and base it on the fundamentals, but really reflect your own view as well.
Just one last question for you would be, as a global CIO, where you're overseeing a very large investment team across the world, you sort of remove biases in terms of, when you think about the world and conviction. Is India a market you look at as being highly convicted from a global portfolio perspective as well? So let's say a global emerging market portfolio. Would India be a high conviction position in those portfolios as well?
Absolutely. India is a high conviction allocation for us, for our Asia portfolios, for our emerging market portfolios, for our small cap portfolios. There's a lot of interesting opportunities there. And what is relevant there is that you've actually got some very positive top-down macro drivers, whether it's reform, whether it's digitalization, whether it's the production-linked incentives I talked about, whether it's the relocation of supply chains from elsewhere and the capital expenditure that's happening in India, but also some very interesting bottom-up companies. So you've got this very attractive top-down and bottom-up story, which is unique around the world.
Well, Manraj, always a pleasure. Great seeing you. And the lunch is coming absolutely on me.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.